The air in the maintenance ducts of Ethelgard Station tasted like copper, stale ozone, and the distinct, lingering scent of Kai's own impending doom. It was a flavor he had become intimately familiar with over the years, though usually it didn't involve holding the hand of a woman whose jewelry probably cost more than his entire ship, the starstruck junkie. "Move, move, move," Kai hissed to himself, his boots clattering against the corrugated metal floor. Behind them, the rhythmic thud of pressurized combat boots echoed, a sound that meant Eldritch Royal Sentinels were very close and very unhappy. "You are breathing quite loudly, Kalen," the woman beside him remarked. Her voice was an anomaly in the dark, cramped tunnel, cool, melodic, and frustratingly composed. "That's called not dying gasps, Your Highness," Kai wheezed, glancing over his shoulder. A flash of crimson light flickered against the curved walls. "Scanners. In my world, if you aren't huffing like a broken compressor, you aren't running fast enough. Also, don't use my full name. It makes me feel like I'm about to get a ticket from the Port Authority." "My apologies, Kai," she corrected, the name sounding strange and delicate on her tongue. They scrambled around a massive junction of coolant pipes that hissed like angry vipers. Kai checked his wrist link. The map was a mess of low-res wireframes. Ethelgard was a masterpiece of architecture on the upper decks, but down here in the guts, it was a labyrinth designed by a sadistic plumber. "We need to hit the secondary bypass," Kai muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "If we can reach the waste disposal chutes, we can slide down to level 8. It's messy, it smells like a recycling plant's bad day, but their scanners can't penetrate the lead lining." Liren Thaloris paused, her long, elegant ears twitching toward the sound of the pursuit. Even in the dim emergency lighting, her skin had a luminous quality, like starlight trapped in alabaster. "Is it sanitary?" Kai let out a short, sharp laugh. "Sanitary? Princess, we are currently being hunted by a dozen 7-foot-tall super soldiers with stun-to-kill settings. At this point, I'd jump into a vat of fermenting G-fruit if it meant keeping my internal organs inside my body." A heavy metallic clunk vibrated through the floor. A hatch had been blown open nearby. "They've breached the sector," Kai whispered, his humor momentarily failing him. He looked at Liren. She wasn't shaking, but her hand in his was cold. "Look, I know this isn't exactly the royal tour you expected when I asked you to dance, but I promise I'm an expert at being a disappointment to authority figures. We'll make it." "I am not afraid for myself, Kai," she said softly, her eyes meeting his with a weight that made his chest ache. "I am afraid of what they will do to the man who dared to touch a queen." "Hey," Kai grinned, though it felt more like a grimace. "In my defense, you were the one who didn't mention the crown. I just saw a beautiful lady who looked like she hated synth jazz as much as I do." Suddenly, the corridor ahead erupted in a blinding grid of red lasers, a perimeter grid. "Bug out!" Kai yelled, skidding to a halt. "Back to the junction! Move!" They turned, but the path was already closing. 3 sentinels in shimmering obsidian armor rounded the corner, their pulse rifles leveled with terrifying precision. The lead guard stepped forward, his voice amplified through a helmet vocoder. "Step away from the queen, civilian. This is your final warning." Kai looked at the lasers, then at the guards, then at Liren. He felt like a malfunctioning navigation drone, spinning in circles, waiting for the crash. How had a simple delivery of biopairs turned into an interstellar incident? It all went back to that damn dance. 5 hours earlier, Ethelgard Station had been a paradise of light and excess. The Solaris Flare Festival was in full swing. It was the one time of the year when the station's fan-shaped sails aligned perfectly with the solar winds of Valanus Prime, creating a shimmering aurora that filled the transparent domes with cascades of gold and violet. Kai Voss had arrived at Docking Bay 42 with a cargo hold full of bruised fruit and a heart full of hope that the harbor master wouldn't notice his expired flight permit. He had managed to grease enough palms to get a temporary pass, and after offloading his crates, he found himself wandering toward the Grand Atrium. He wasn't supposed to be there. The Grand Atrium was for the shiners, the diplomats, the corporate moguls, and the high-ranking officers of the Convergence. But Kai had a knack for looking like he belonged exactly where he shouldn't be. He had swapped his grease-stained flight jacket for a somewhat clean vest and slicked back his hair with a bit of engine lubricant. It worked surprisingly well. The music was a dense layer of crystalline chimes and deep thrumming bass that seemed to vibrate in his marrow. Above, floating chandeliers made of captured nebular gas drifted lazily, changing hues with every beat. It was beautiful, oppressive, and incredibly loud. Kai leaned against a pillar, nursing a drink that tasted like fermented battery acid. He felt out of place. He was a creature of the void, of rusted hulls and the quiet hum of a warp drive. Here, everything was too shiny, too perfect. Then he saw her. She stood by the balcony overlooking the internal gardens, a solitary figure in a sea of swirling colors. She wore a gown of G-new fabric that flowed like liquid silver, but it was her expression that caught him. She wasn't enjoying the festival. She was enduring it. Every few seconds, her long, tapered ears would flatten slightly, a sign of extreme distress in Eldritch physiology, or so he'd heard on the trader channels. "Rough night?" Kai asked, slipping into the space beside her before he could talk himself out of it. She didn't turn immediately. "It is a night of significant geopolitical importance," she replied, her voice distant. "Right. That's diplomat speak, for I'd rather be literally anywhere else," Kai said, taking a sip of his questionable drink. "I get it. I once spent 3 days in a cargo hold with a grumpy octopod. Even that had more stimulating conversation than this gala." She turned then, and for the first time Kai saw her eyes properly. They were deep indigo, speckled with gold like a star chart. She looked at him with a mixture of confusion and genuine curiosity. "You are a pilot?" "Kai Voss, freelancer, professional survivor, part-time disappointment," he said, offering a mock bow. "And you look like you're about to bolt for the nearest airlock. Before you do, would you consider a distraction?" "A distraction?" Kai gestured toward the dance floor, where dozens of couples were performing a complex, gravity-defying waltz. "Dance with me. I promise I have absolutely no sense of rhythm, and I will almost certainly step on your very expensive shoes, but I'm a great listener if you need to complain about the appetizers." A flicker of something, amusement, crossed her face. "You are asking a stranger to dance in the middle of a high-security event? You are either very brave or very foolish, Master Voss. Why choose?" Kai grinned. "I'm a healthy mix of both. It's the only way to stay sane in this galaxy." She hesitated, her gaze flicking toward a group of stern-looking men in crimson robes whispering nearby. Then she reached out and placed her hand in his. Her skin was warm, a startling contrast to the cold perfection of the station. "I am Lyran," she said simply. "Well, Lyran, let's go show these shiners how a real malfunction looks on the dance floor." They stepped onto the floor. Kai was right. He was terrible. He stumbled during the first tempo shift, nearly knocking over a tray of floating helium puffs. Lyran laughed, a soft, startled sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. "You move like a ship with a blown thruster," she whispered, her ears tilting forward in a gesture of genuine interest. "Hey, it's a style. I call it the controlled crash," Kai countered, spinning her, a bit too fast, but she followed with effortless grace. For a few minutes, the weight of the galaxy disappeared. There were no debts, no expired permits, and no looming political marriages. There was just the warmth of her hand, the smell of her perfume, like rain on a desert moon, and the ridiculous, wonderful feeling of being somewhere he didn't belong. "I haven't felt light in a very long time," Lyran murmured, her head leaning slightly toward his shoulder. "That's the secret, Lyran," Kai said, his voice dropping an octave. "Most people here are trying to be someone else. I've spent my whole life being exactly who I am, a mess. It's much less exhausting." The moment was shattered by a sharp, high-pitched chime that cut through the music. The floating chandeliers turned a deep, warning red. Lyran stiffened, her ears snapping back. "They found me." "Who?" Kai asked, his internal alarm bells finally screaming. "My future," she said, her eyes filling with a sudden, sharp terror. "And you're ending if we don't move right now?" Before Kai could ask for a brochure on what exactly was happening, the first squad of sentinels burst through the atrium doors, and the waltz turned into a sprint. The transition from the velvet-lined opulence of the grand atrium to the rusted, echoing bowels of Ethelgard was like a sudden decompression. One moment, Kai was a man pretending to be a gentleman. The next, he was a rabbit in a hole made of durasteel and disappointment. The red lasers of the perimeter grid danced across his chest like hungry insects. Kai's hands were up, his palms sweaty, while the three obsidian-clad sentinels moved with the synchronized lethality of a single organism. Their pulse rifles hummed, a low predatory vibration that Kai could feel in his teeth. "Identity confirmed," the lead sentinel boomed, his helmet visor glowing with a jagged blue data stream. "Subject, Kai Voss. Occupation, cargo hauler. Criminal record. 7 counts of unauthorized docking, 3 counts of evading port fees, 1 count of accidental discharge of fire suppressant in a high-security zone." "In my defense," Kai shouted, his voice cracking just a bit, "that fire suppressant was a total glitch in the system. And can we talk about the subject thing? It's so impersonal. My friends call me Kai. My enemies call me, well, they usually just shoot." "Silence, civilian," the guard barked. He turned his attention to Lyraean, his posture shifting from aggressive to a stiff, robotic form of reverence. "Your Majesty, Queen Lyraean Thaloris, the Regency demands your immediate return. Lord Malachor has initiated a Level 5 security sweep. The station is being locked down for your protection." "Protection?" Lyran stepped out from behind Kai. Her voice had lost its warmth. It was now a blade of ice, polished and sharp. "You mean my containment? Tell Malachor that the Queen is not a piece of cargo to be swept up and crated." "Your Majesty, the human has compromised your safety," the guard replied, his rifle barrel twitching toward Kai's head. "He is to be detained for interrogation regarding his involvement in your attempted abdication of duty." Kai's heart did a frantic tap dance against his ribs. "Whoa, whoa! Abdication? I just asked for a dance, man. I didn't even know she had a title. I thought she was just a very tall, very pretty lady with a lot of stress." "Do not lie, filth," the second guard growled. "No one approaches a queen of the Eldritch Dominion without a motive. You're likely a hired extraction specialist for the rebel fringe." "I can barely extract a stuck power cell from my own ship," Kai protested. He looked at Lyran, seeking some kind of lifeline. "Tell them I'm just a moron. It's the truth. It's my most consistent character trait." Lyran looked at the guards, then back at Kai. In that moment, something shifted in her indigo eyes. She saw the sheer, unadulterated panic in him, but she also saw that he hadn't run. He was still standing there, even though every survival instinct he possessed was clearly screaming for him to bolt. "He is not a rebel," Lyrian said firmly. "He is my guest. And under the ancient code of the high skies, anyone under the Queen's shadow is untouchable." The lead guard hesitated. Kai could practically hear the gears of bureaucracy grinding behind that obsidian helmet. "The code has been suspended during the transition of power to Lord Malachor, Your Majesty." "Malachor does not have the authority to suspend the code until the marriage rites are finalized," she countered. "And since I have not yet walked the solar path, I am still the law." The tension in the tunnel was thick enough to clog a fuel filter. One of the guards shifted his weight, his finger tightening on the trigger. Kai knew that look. It was the look of a soldier who had secret orders that trumped public laws. "They aren't going to let us walk, are they?" Kai whispered, his eyes darting to a steam vent just 3 meters to his left. "It appears not," Lyrian replied quietly. "Okay, on the count of 3, I'm going to do something really stupid," Kai muttered. "More stupid than asking a queen to dance? Way more. 1, 2, smoke check." Kai didn't have a weapon, but he did have a pilot's utility belt. He reached for a small cylindrical canister, an emergency hull sealant foam, and smashed the nozzle against the floor. Instead of sealing a hole, the pressurized foam erupted in a violent, expanding cloud of white chemicals. "Flash bang! Move your boots!" Kai yelled, grabbing Lyran's hand and lunging toward the steam vent. The guards opened fire, but the foam acted as a temporary opaque shield, scattering the red pulse bolts into harmless light shows. Kai kicked the grate of the steam vent with everything he had. It didn't budge. He kicked it again, screaming in frustration. "Let me," Lyran said. She stepped forward, her hand glowing with a faint, ethereal violet light. She pressed her palm against the metal. With a sound like a dying engine, the grate simply disintegrated into fine dust. "Okay, note to self, Princess has glowy death hands." Kai muttered as they scrambled into the dark shaft. They slid down a vertical pipe, gravity pulling at Kai's stomach. He hit a pile of discarded insulation with a muffled umph, while Lyran landed beside him with the grace of a falling leaf. They were in level 12, the guts. This was where the station's massive life support systems hummed, a place of endless darkness and the smell of ancient oil. Kai scrambled to his feet, checking his wrist link. We've got about 20 minutes before they recalibrate their sensors to track us through the foam residue. We need to move through the decon chambers. Kai, Lyran said, stopping him. She looked around at the dripping pipes and the flickering lights. Why are you still helping me? You know who I am now. You know that staying with me is a death sentence. You could have surrendered. They would have probably just tossed you in a brig for a few weeks. Kai stopped and looked at her. He thought about his ship, the starstruck junkie, sitting in Docking Bay 42. He thought about his bank account, which currently held exactly 12 credits. He thought about his father, who had always told him that he was a broken component that would never fit into a functional machine. I've spent my whole life being the guy who fails, Kai said, his voice surprisingly steady. I failed the academy. I failed my crew. I even fail at basic social interaction. But back there, when you looked at me, you didn't see a failure. You saw a partner. For once, I'd like to finish something without breaking it. Lyran looked at him for a long time. The distance in her gaze, that royal wall she kept between herself and the world, seemed to crack just a fraction of a millimeter. You are a very strange human, Kai Voss, she whispered. I prefer the term uniquely calibrated, Kai replied with a weak grin. Now come on, we have to walk through a literal trash heap to get to my ship. Welcome to the glamorous life of a freelance pilot. Level 12 was not designed for human or eldritch comfort. It was a sprawling network of maintenance tunnels, waste processing vats, and the Rat's Alley, a lawless strip of the station where the people who didn't exist tended to congregate. These were the ghost hands, the undocumented workers who kept the station running in exchange for scraps of oxygen and recycled water. As Kai and Lyran emerged from the maintenance shaft, they were greeted by the sight of dozens of eyes glowing in the shadows. The air was thick with the smell of cheap synthetic tobacco and the metallic tang of blue juice, a low-grade stimulant used by the miners. Keep your head down and your hands closed, Kai whispered, his hand resting on the hilt of his multi-tool. These folks aren't inherently bad, but a queen's jewelry is worth enough to buy this entire sector 10 times over. Don't flash the bling. Lyran pulled a discarded oily tarp over her shoulders, concealing her shimmering gown. I understand. I have spent my life surrounded by wealth I did not earn. It is humbling to see the foundation upon which my throne is built. They moved quickly through the crowded alley. People huddled around glowing heaters made from repurposed engine cores. A group of scavengers was haggling over a pile of rusted circuit boards. Hey, Kai! A voice rasped from a dark corner. Kai froze. Out of the shadows stepped a man who looked like he had been put together from spare parts. He had a cybernetic eye that whirred as it focused, and his skin was a patchwork of scars and grease. Ratchet, Kai said, exhaling in relief. You still alive? I heard the squids caught you in the last raid. Took more than a few squids to bring me down, kid. The man Ratchet grinned, revealing a row of mismatched teeth. His gaze shifted to Lyran. His cybernetic eye whirred louder. Who's the high shine you've got there? She smells like the upper decks. She's a friend, Kai said quickly. We're in a bit of a rapid extraction scenario. The Sentinels are hot on our heels. We need a way to the secondary docking rings without hitting the main elevators. Ratchet whistled low. Sentinels? You don't play small, do you, Kai? That's code red trouble. If I help you, the Dominion will have my head on a pike. I'll give you the coordinates to that derelict freighter I found near Velonis 3, Kai offered. The one with the intact fusion core. Ratchet's organic eye widened. The fusion core? You're serious? Dead serious. Just get us past the checkpoints. Ratchet looked at Lyran again. He seemed to sense the gravity of her presence, the quiet power she held even under a dirty tarp. All right, follow me. But stay in the shadows. The peacekeepers have been twitchy all night. They followed Ratchet through a series of narrow, damp corridors that seemed to double back on themselves. Kai stayed close to Lyrian, his eyes scanning every shadow. He felt a strange sense of responsibility he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just hauling cargo anymore. He was hauling a future. Kai, Lyrian whispered as they ducked under a low-hanging coolant pipe. Why did that man call you kid? You're at least 30 years old. It's an old nickname, Kai replied, feeling a flush of heat in his cheeks. When I first started out, let's just say I was prone to making mistakes. Big ones. Ratchet was the one who taught me how to fix a ship with nothing but a roll of thermal tape and a lot of swearing. He seems to respect you. He respects the fact that I'm still breathing. On this station, that's a high bar. They reached a heavy circular door marked with the symbol of the Waste Management Division. Ratchet punched a code into a battered keypad. This leads to the chutes, Ratchet said. Wait for the green light on the cycle. When it hits, you've got 10 seconds to jump before the incinerator sequence starts. It'll drop you right into the secondary docking ring near the freighter bays. Kai looked at the door, then at Ratchet. Thanks, old man. I owe you. Just don't get dead, Kai, Ratchet grunted. The galaxy is boring enough as it is. As the door hissed open, a blast of cold air hit them. Beyond lay a dark, sloping tunnel that vanished into the depths of the station. Ready for another uniquely calibrated experience? Kai asked, offering his hand to Lyrian. She took it, her grip firm. I find that I'm becoming quite fond of them. They stepped into the chute just as the light turned green. For a few seconds, there was only the sensation of falling, the rush of wind, and the sound of their hearts beating in unison. When they finally tumbled out onto a pile of soft, synthetic shipping pellets, they were in the secondary docking ring. It was quieter here, the air smelling of fuel and distant stars. Kai scrambled to his feet, helping Lyrian up. There she is, Kai said, pointing toward a battered, lopsided ship that looked like it had been through a few wars and lost all of them. The star-struck junkie. She isn't much to look at, but she's fast when she wants to be. Lyrian looked at the ship. It was covered in patches of mismatched hull plating, and one of its thrusters was held in place by what looked like heavy-duty chains. It is charming, she said, her voice filled with a gentle diplomacy. It's a disaster, Kai corrected, but it's my disaster, and right now it's our only way out of here. But as they approached the boarding ramp, the lights of the docking bay flared to life. Dozens of soldiers stepped out from behind the crates, their weapons aimed directly at them, and in the center of the circle stood a man in crimson and gold, his face twisted in a sneer of cold triumph. Your Majesty, Lord Malachor said, his voice echoing through the bay. The dance is over. Kai felt his stomach drop. He had failed. Again. He looked at Lyrian, expecting to see disappointment, expecting to see her surrender. Instead, she stood taller than he had ever seen her. She dropped the tarp, letting her silver gown catch the harsh light of the docking bay. The dance hasn't even begun, Malachor, she said, her voice ringing with a power that made the soldiers flinch. Kai gripped his multi-tool. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the odds. He was tired of being the broken component. He was ready to be the one who fought back. All right, Malachor, Kai shouted, his voice echoing Lyrian's strength. If you want her, you're going to have to go through the pilot. And I should warn you, I've had a really, really long day. The soldiers moved forward, and the silence of the docking bay was shattered by the sound of a queen choosing her own fate and a pilot finally finding his worth. The atmosphere in docking bay 88 was thick enough to choke a fuel intake. Lord Malachor didn't look like a man who enjoyed festivals. He looked like a man who had been carved out of a cold, unforgiving asteroid and dressed in the finery of a dying empire. His crimson robes trailed behind him like a river of dried blood, and his eyes, a dull, metallic gray, were fixed on Lyrian with a possessive intensity that made Kai's skin crawl. You have caused a significant amount of paperwork, Your Majesty, Malachor said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate the very deck plates. And you, he shifted his gaze to Kai, flicking an imaginary speck of dust from his sleeve. You are the statistical anomaly that has disrupted a trillion credit merger. I find anomalies irritating. Kai shifted his weight, his hand still white-knuckled around his multi-tool. He felt like a mouse trying to intimidate a mountain, but he didn't back down. Irritating? That's the nicest thing anyone said to me all day. Usually I'm just unauthorized or dangerously incompetent. Glad I could upgrade my status. The human has nothing to do with this, Malachor. Liren stepped forward, her silver gown shimmering with a defiant light. I left of my own accord. I sought a moment of peace before I was consigned to a life of political theater. If you have a grievance, address it to me. Let the pilot go. He has a ship to repair and a life to lead far away from your reach. Malachor let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so devoid of joy. A life to lead? He is a common scavenger, Lyrian. Look at him. He is a collection of failures held together by engine grease and misplaced bravado. He is exactly the kind of chaos I intend to scrub from the Dominion. He gestured to the 24 sentinels surrounding them. Subdue the human. Prepare the Queen for the voyage to Eldritch Prime. We have wasted enough time on this dalliance. The guards moved. It wasn't a rush. It was a slow, inevitable closing of the circle. Kai felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, that frantic fight-or-flight response that usually ended with him doing a lot of the latter. But as he looked at Lyrian, as he saw the way she braced herself, not with the arrogance of a ruler, but with the quiet dignity of a woman refusing to be erased, the flight part of his brain simply switched off. "Listen up, you chrome-plated bucketheads," Kai yelled, his voice echoing through the massive bay. "The lady said the party's over. And as for you, Malachor, you want an anomaly? I'll give you an anomaly." Kai reached into his belt and pulled out a small, palm-sized device he'd spent 3 months building out of salvaged scrap. It was a localized gravity inverter, a piece of tech so unstable it shouldn't have worked on a station with a functional brain. He thumbed the activation switch. "Time to bug out, princess," Kai shouted. The device emitted a high-pitched whine that set every tooth in Kai's head on edge. For a split second, the gravity in a 10-meter radius around them simply ceased to exist. The sentinels, weighted down by their heavy obsidian armor, were suddenly adrift, flailing like beetles on their backs. Crates of spare parts, fuel canisters, and several decorative banners lifted into the air. Malachor, caught on the edge of the field, lurched upward, his robes billowing around him in a frantic, unregal mess. "Now!" Kai grabbed Lyran's waist, using the recoil of his multi-tool's magnetic pulse to propel them toward the starstruck junkie. They drifted through the air, dodging floating debris and reaching out for the ship's boarding ramp. Lyran used her glowy death hands, the eldritch energy she possessed, to shove aside a floating sentinel who tried to grab her ankle. The guard spun away into the darkness of the bay, his boots clanking uselessly against a passing coolant tank. They hit the ramp hard. Kai scrambled to the control panel, his fingers dancing over the battered keys with a speed he didn't know he possessed. "Get inside! Seal the hatch!" Lyran dove through the opening just as the gravity inverter burned out with a shower of sparks. The heavy thump of re-established gravity echoed through the bay, followed immediately by the shouts of very angry, very bruised soldiers. "Kai, they are opening fire!" Lyran screamed from the cockpit. I know! Kai scrambled into the pilot's seat, slamming the sequence for emergency engine ignition. "Come on, girl. Don't fail me now. Think of all the premium fuel I've been promising you." The starstruck junkie groaned. It was a sound of deep mechanical exhaustion. The ship shivered, the hull plates rattling like a bag of bolts. Outside, pulse fire began to hammer against their shields that were currently at 40% capacity and dropping. "Malachor is ordering the station's tractor beams to lock on," Lyran shouted, her indigo eyes wide as she watched the sensor displays. "Not on my watch," Kai gritted his teeth. He bypassed the safety limiters on the thrusters, a move that would have given his academy instructors a heart attack. "I didn't spend 5 years dodging debt collectors to get snagged by a glorified magnet." The ship roared to life, a violent, bucking surge of power that threw them back into their seats. The junkie tore away from the docking cradle, shearing off several refueling lines in a spectacular spray of sparks and frozen gas. As they plummeted out of Ethelgard and into the swirling gold mists of Veloni's prime, Kai risked a glance at the monitors. Malachor stood on the docking platform, his figure small but his posture radiating a cold, lethal promise. He wasn't chasing them. Not yet. He was waiting. "We're out," Kai exhaled, his hands trembling as he leveled the ship. "We're actually out." "But for how long?" Liren asked, her voice trembling. She looked at her hands, still glowing faintly with that strange purple light. "Malachor does not lose, Kai. He will hunt us across the entire sector. He will turn the stars themselves against us." "Let him try," Kai said, though he didn't feel nearly as confident as he sounded. "I've been hiding from people who want my head for a decade. The only difference is, this time, I've got something worth keeping it for." But as he looked at the damage report, engines overheating, shields flickering, and a mysterious leak in the life support system, the weight of what he had just done began to sink in. He had stolen a queen. He had declared war on a dominion. He was still just a broken pilot in a broken ship. And for the first time, he realized that being yourself might just be a very fancy way of getting killed. 2 hours into the void, and the silence was more oppressive than the shouting. The star-struck junkie was drifting in the shadow of a massive frozen moon on the outskirts of the Valoni system. Kai had cut the main power to minimize their thermal signature, leaving them in a dim, amber-lit world of humming vents and the faint, rhythmic clicking of the cooling engines. Kai was hunched over a terminal in the tiny galley, trying to coax a portable heater back to life. He looked exhausted. There was a smudge of grease across his forehead, and his eyes were bloodshot. The bravado of the docking bay had evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of a man who had successfully jumped off a cliff and was now wondering if he'd forgotten his parachute. "I've managed to patch the life support leak," he muttered, more to the heater than to Lyrian, who was sitting at the small table. "We've got about 48 hours of breathable air before the scrubbers give up the ghost. After that, things are going to get crispy." Lyran didn't respond. She had removed her silver gown, now wearing one of Kai's oversized flight jumpsuits. The sight of a Queen of the Eldritch in a grease-stained one-piece uniform would have been funny if the circumstances weren't so dire. She was staring at a small holographic charm she'd taken from her neck, a tiny flickering image of a sprawling palace made of glass and light. "Is that home?" Kai asked softly. "It is a cage," she replied, her voice flat. "A beautiful, gilded cage where every word I spoke was scripted by a council of old men who haven't seen the sun in 50 years. They told me that my marriage to Malachor was the only thing standing between our people and a civil war. They told me that my desires were irrelevant." Kai sat down across from her, his multi-tool forgotten on the table. "I get it. Not the queen part, obviously, but the irrelevant part? Yeah, that's been my theme song since I was 10. My old man used to say I was a glitch in the lineage. My brothers were all decorated officers, and I was the guy who accidentally blew up the school's navigation lab because I wanted to see if I could make a ship go faster by rewiring the flux capacitors." "Idarana," Lyran looked up, her indigo eyes searching his. "Did you? Make it go faster?" "Oh, it went faster," Kai grinned, a flash of his old self returning. "It went so fast it tore a hole in the reality of the principal's office. I was expelled before the smoke cleared. My dad didn't even yell. He just looked at me like I was a piece of equipment that was too expensive to fix and too broken to use. That hurt more than the yelling." "He was wrong," Lyran said firmly. "Back in the docking bay, when you bypassed those tractor beams, it wasn't a glitch. It was brilliance. Malachor's pilots follow the manual. You follow the soul of the machine." "Maybe," Kai shrugged, looking away. "But the soul of the machine currently has a cracked manifold and no shields. Brilliance doesn't keep you warm when the power dies." "You think your flaws make you less, Kai," she said, leaning forward. Her long ears twitched, catching the faint vibrations of the ship. "But it is those very flaws that allowed you to see me. Everyone else saw a queen. You saw a woman who hated jazz. You saw the truth because you don't look through the lens of perfection." Kai was silent. He wasn't used to this lack of judgment. In his world, you were only as good as your last successful haul. To be seen, truly seen, with all his failures and his messy improvised life, was terrifying. It was a test he wasn't sure he could pass. "We need a plan," he said, shifting the subject. "Malachor isn't just going to wait. He's probably already pinged every bounty hunter from here to the rim. We can't stay in this system." "There is a place," Lyran said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The Shards of Etheria. It is a nebula of crystalline dust and unstable radiation. My people used to use it as a sanctuary during the Great Collapse. If we can get there, his sensors won't be able to track us. The shards, Kai whistled. That's a pilot's nightmare. The radiation eats through hulls like acid, and the dust makes navigation impossible. It's a graveyard for ships, Lyran. It is a graveyard for those who fear the dark, she countered. But you have spent your life in the dark, haven't you? You know how to feel your way through the void. Kai looked at her, then at the flickering monitors of his dying ship. The choice was clear. They could stay here and wait for the inevitable capture, a life of chains for her, and a quick, unauthorized execution for him. Or they could dive into the heart of a nightmare and bet everything on the one thing Kai had always hated about himself, his inability to follow the rules. All right, Kai said, standing up. The shards it is, but I'm going to need you to help me with the manual overrides. It's going to be a bumpy ride, and I don't want you hitting your head on the ceiling. Royal brains are probably hard to clean off the upholstery. Lyran stood as well, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. I shall endeavor to keep my brain where it belongs, Kai. They moved back to the cockpit, but as Kai reached for the ignition, the ship's internal AI, a voice Kai had nicknamed Rusty, flickered to life. Warning, Rusty's voice crackled, sounding more like a person with a bad cold than a computer. Incoming transmission detected. Long-range burst. Origin, Eldritch Royal Fleet. Don't open it, Kai said. It's a trap. It is a personal frequency, Lyrian said, her face paling. Only my sister knows this code. She tapped the screen. The holographic image of a young Eldritch woman appeared, her face tear-streaked and panicked. Lyrian, if you are hearing this, do not come back. Malachor has declared the Regency in a state of emergency. He is accusing you of being kidnapped by a human terrorist. He has already executed the council members who spoke in your defense. He is coming for you, sister. He has a tracker on the message dissolved into static. A tracker? Kai's heart skipped a beat. He looked at Lyran. He said he had a tracker on the what? Lyran looked at her hands, then at the jumpsuit she was wearing. Slowly, she reached for the small holographic charm she had been holding earlier, the one showing her palace. The charm, she whispered. It is a gift from Malachor. Before Kai could react, the sensors on the junkie screamed in a frantic, high-pitched wail. Contact! Multiple warp sigs detected, Rusty shouted. 3 heavy cruisers and a dozen interceptors. They're right on top of us. Kai slammed his hands onto the controls, but it was too late. The massive shadow of an eldritch dreadnought eclipsed the frozen moon. A blinding beam of light hit the junkie, and the ship's systems groaned as the tractor beam locked on with a force that felt like the hand of a god. He didn't just find us, Kai whispered, looking at the overwhelming force outside. He let us think we'd escaped. He let me feel like a hero just so he could watch me fail one last time. Lyran turned to him, her eyes filled with a desperate apology. Kai, I am so sorry. I didn't know. It's okay, Kai said, though it wasn't. He looked at the multi-tool on the dash, then at the queen who had believed in him. I told you I was a failure, Lyran. I guess I was right all along. As the star-struck junkie was pulled toward the massive open hangar of the dreadnought, the humanistic theme Kai had been trying to ignore hit him with the weight of a dying star. The cost of not believing in yourself isn't just your own life. It's the lives of the people who dared to believe in you. The hangar bay of the dreadnought, the Sovereign's breath, was a cathedral of cold efficiency. It was a space designed to make individuals feel like dust. As the star-struck junkie was dragged into the magnetic cradle, Kai felt every shudder of his ship like a physical blow to his spine. The lights of the hangar were a harsh, clinical white, illuminating the rows of interceptors and the hundreds of soldiers standing at attention. Inside the cockpit, the air felt thin. Kai didn't look at Lyran. He couldn't. The weight of his own prediction, that he would eventually break everything he touched, was a suffocating blanket. I'm sorry, he whispered, his hands dropping from the dead controls. I should have scanned the charm. I should have known. A guy like me. I'm just not built for the big plays, Lyran. I'm a short circuit in a high-voltage world. Lyran reached across the console, her fingers brushing his arm. Kai, look at me. You did not place the tracker. You did not build this ship to fail. You gave me 2 hours of freedom that I have never known in 28 years. Do not let Malachor take that from you before he even steps on board. He doesn't have to take it, Kai muttered, his voice thick with self-loathing. I'm giving it to him for free. Puru, the boarding ramp hissed open. It wasn't Kai who opened it. The dreadnought's systems had simply overridden his ancient security codes like they were tissue paper. Lord Malachor entered the ship alone. He didn't need guards here. The junkie was a cage within a cage. Malachor walked through the cramped, messy galley, his crimson robes brushing against stacks of empty nutrient paste tubes and loose wires. He looked around with a sneer of profound disgust. To think, Malachor said, his voice echoing in the small space, that the future of the Eldritch Dominion was nearly derailed by a man who lives in a glorified scrap heap. It's almost poetic in its absurdity. He stopped at the cockpit door. Liren stood, her chin high, blocking his path to Kai. Leave him, Malachor. You have your queen. You have your alliance. Let the pilot drift. He is nothing to you. On the contrary, Malachor smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Kai had ever seen. He is the perfect example of why the Dominion requires order. He is a glitch, as he so aptly put it, and glitches must be purged to ensure the system remains stable. Malachor reached out, his hand glowing with a dark, oppressive red energy, a corrupted version of the eldritch power Lyrian possessed. He didn't strike her. He simply moved her aside with a wave of kinetic force that pinned her against the bulkhead. Now, Master Voss, Malachor said, stepping toward Kai. Let us see what lies beneath the humor and the grease. Kai didn't fight. He felt hollow. He expected a blow, a blast of energy, something to end the embarrassment of his existence. But Malachor didn't strike. He reached into Kai's mind. It wasn't a physical pain, but a psychic violation. Malachor's power tore through Kai's memories. The expulsion from the academy, the disappointed look on his father's face, the long nights of hunger on Ethelgard. Malachor was looking for a weakness, but he found something else. The deep, abiding belief Kai held that he was worthless. Ah, Malachor whispered, his eyes glowing. You do the work for me. You have spent your entire life convincing yourself that you are a mistake. Why should I bother killing a man who has already executed his own spirit? Malachor turned back to Liren. See, my queen? This is the hero you chose. A man who agrees with his enemies. He doesn't believe he deserves to save you. And because of that, he never will. Liren struggled against the invisible pressure pinning her to the wall. He is more of a man than you will ever be, Malachor. He knows his flaws. You only hide yours behind a crown. Flaws are for the weak, Malachor said coldly. He looked back at Kai, who was staring at the floor, his spirit shattered. I will leave you here, Voss. I will leave you in this ship, drifting in the void without fuel or air. You can spend your final 48 hours contemplating the exact moment you became a failure. It's a fitting end for a broken component. As Malachor dragged Lyrian out of the ship, her screams echoed through the hangar. Kai sat in the pilot's seat, motionless. The hangar doors began to close, and the star-struck junkie was unceremoniously shoved back out into the vacuum by a robotic arm. The silence that followed was absolute. Kai stared at the empty seat beside him. The smell of her perfume, that scent of rain on a desert moon, still lingered. He looked at his hands, covered in the grease of a ship that couldn't fly, and the shame of a man who couldn't fight. Rusty, Kai whispered. Systems at 5%, the AI crackled. Life support failing. We are, as the humans say, screwed, Kai. Yeah, Kai said, his voice cracking. Screwed. He looked at the multi-tool on the dash. He thought about Malachor's words. A man who agrees with his enemies. Was that it? Was his whole life just a long, slow surrender to the idea that he wasn't good enough? He thought about the dance. He thought about the way Lyren had laughed when he stumbled. She hadn't laughed at his failure. She had laughed at his humanity. She had seen the glitch and called it brilliance. I'm not a component, Kai whispered, his grip tightening on the multi-tool. I'm the guy who rewired the flux capacitors. I'm the guy who makes the impossible work with thermal tape and a prayer. Something shifted, not in the ship, but in the core of who Kai Voss was. The pain of the realization was sharp, like a bone setting, but it was real. If he was a mistake, then he was a mistake that the universe couldn't predict, and unpredictable things were dangerous. Rusty, Kai said, his voice growing louder, divert all remaining power to the internal comms. I need to talk to the ship. The ship, Kai? It's a hull and some wires. No, Kai said, standing up and heading for the engine room. It's my soul, and it's time we showed Malachor what happens when you try to purge a glitch. The starstruck junkie didn't look like a threat. To the sensors of the Sovereign's breath, it was a piece of debris, a metallic carcass waiting for the cold embrace of the nebula. But inside, Kai was working with a manic, desperate energy. He wasn't following the manual. He was tearing it up and feeding it to the furnace. He had stripped the casing off the main reactor, exposing the pulsing heart of the ship. "This is going to blow us to atoms, isn't it?" Rusty asked, the holographic interface flickering wildly. "Probably," Kai said, his teeth gritted as he twisted two high-voltage cables together with his bare hands. The shock sent a jolt through his arms, but he didn't let go. "But Malachor thinks I'm a failure. He thinks I'm going to sit here and wait for the air to run out. He's counting on my self-doubt to do his job for him. Well, I'm done being his deputy." Kai was building a slingshot drive. It was a theoretical concept he'd read about in a forbidden journal, a way to use the ship's own artificial gravity generators to create a forward-facing kinetic pulse. It would turn the ship into a railgun slug. "Kai, the hull won't take the pressure," Rusty warned. "We'll be pancake matter before we hit the hangar shields." "Then don't let us hit the shields," Kai shouted. "I'm going to use the Gnu fabric from Lerayan's dress." He scrambled back to the galley, grabbing the silver gown she had left behind. The fabric was designed to distribute weight and pressure. He began wrapping it around the cockpit's structural supports, lashing it down with heavy-duty cables. It was a mess. It was ugly. It was uniquely calibrated. "If this works," Kai muttered, "I'm definitely charging 100,000 marks for the patent." On the dreadnought, the marriage ceremony was beginning. Malachor stood on the command deck, his hand resting on Larian's shoulder. The entire Eldritch fleet was watching via high-def transmission. "By the light of the stars," Malachor began, "we bind these two—" "Warning!" an ensign shouted, interrupting the ritual. "Unidentified kinetic signature approaching at high velocity." Malachor frowned. "Debris? Clear it with the point defense cannons." "It's not debris, my lord. It's the cargo ship. It's accelerating at 500% of its rated capacity." In the cockpit of the junkie, Kai was screaming, not in fear but in a raw, cathartic release of 32 years of suppressed rage. The ship was glowing white-hot as it tore through the thin atmosphere of the nebula's edge. The Gnu fabric groaned, stretching to its absolute limit as it held the cockpit together against the soul-crushing G-force. "Bug out of the way, you bastards!" "Go on," Kai yelled, his hand slamming onto the final ignition switch. The starstruck junkie didn't fire a shot. It didn't need to. It was a 500-ton hammer hitting an obsidian nail. Kai aimed for the hangar doors, the same ones that had spat him out. The kinetic pulse at the front of the ship acted like a wedge, shattering the dreadnought's shields for a microsecond. The junkie punched through the heavy durasteel doors like a bullet through a tin can, skidding across the hangar floor in a spectacular explosion of sparks and screaming metal. The ship came to a halt inches away from the command elevator. The hull was smoking, the wings were gone, and the engines were a molten heap. The hangar was silent. Every soldier, every technician, stood frozen in shock. The boarding ramp, warped and blackened, groaned open. Kai Voss stepped out. He was covered in soot, his flight jumpsuit was shredded, and his left arm was hanging limp at his side. But he wasn't looking at the floor. He was looking up. He held his multi-tool like a scepter. "I believe," Kai wheezed, his voice carrying through the silent hangar, "that the Queen still owes me the rest of that dance." Malachor appeared on the hangar balcony, his face a mask of incredulous fury. You are still alive? How? You are a failure. You are a glitch." Kai looked up at him and smiled. It wasn't the nervous, self-deprecating grin of the pilot from Ethelgard. It was the smile of a man who had finally accepted that his flaws weren't a weakness. They were the very thing that made him invincible. "Yeah," Kai shouted, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "I am a glitch. And you know what they say about glitches, Malachor? They're the only things that can crash a perfect system." From the shadows of the balcony, Lyraean saw him. She saw the man she had believed in, standing in the wreckage of his own destruction, refusing to break. The violet light in her hands flared with a sudden, blinding intensity. She realized then that Kai hadn't just saved her life. He had saved her soul by showing her that perfection was a lie, and that the only thing worth fighting for was the beautiful, messy truth of being alive. The sentinels moved to intercept Kai, but they hesitated. There was something about the way he stood, the sheer, stubborn weight of a man who had finally found his purpose, that made their training feel irrelevant. "Let's move," Kai whispered to himself, his fingers tightening on the multi-tool. Time to finish the job. The cost of his transformation was high. A broken ship, a broken arm, and a price on his head that would last 1,000 years. But as Kai started to walk toward the elevator, he didn't feel like a broken component. He felt like the heart of the machine. The silence following the crash of the starstruck junkie was heavier than the vacuum of space. Smoke curled in lazy charcoal ribbons from the shattered hull, smelling of burnt GNU fabric and the ozone of a dying reactor. Kai Voss stood in the center of the carnage, his breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. His left arm felt like it had been put through a high-pressure recycler, but the pain was distant, a dull thrumming compared to the clarity of the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Around him, the Eldritch sentinels were a sea of obsidian statues. They hadn't moved. They were trained for insurgencies, for orbital strikes, and for diplomatic betrayals. They were not trained for a man who had turned a garbage scow into a kinetic missile because he finally stopped agreeing with his own self-doubt. "I said," Kai repeated, his voice rasping through the soot in his throat, "the Queen owes me a dance." High above on the command balcony, Lord Malakor's face was no longer a mask of cold triumph. It was a distorted snarl of disbelief. He gripped the railing so hard the metal groaned. "What are you waiting for? Kill him! He is one man. He is a broken, unauthorized stray. Put an end to this anomaly." The guards shifted, their pulse rifles rising in a terrifying, synchronized motion. But before the first bolt could leave a barrel, a shimmer of violet light erupted from the balcony. Lyran didn't scream. She didn't plead. She simply stepped forward, and the power she had spent 28 years suppressing, the power of a true Eldritch Queen, flowed out of her in a visible wave. It wasn't the dark, oppressive red of Malakor's corruption. It was the bright, searing purple of a star being born. The kinetic pressure was so immense that the sentinels were forced to lower their weapons just to keep their footing. "The pilot is under my shadow," Lyran's voice vibrated through the hangar, amplified by the ship's own comnet. "And my shadow is now the law of this fleet." She looked down at Kai. There was no pity in her eyes, only a fierce, radiant pride. She saw the blood on his face and the wreck of his life behind him, and she saw it for what it truly was, a masterpiece of survival. Kai looked up and felt the last of his old armor, the armor of being a failure, fall away. He didn't need to be the perfect pilot from the academy. He didn't need to be the son his father wanted. He just needed to be the glitch that refused to be fixed. He raised his right hand, the one holding the multi-tool, and pointed it directly at Malakor. "Your system just crashed, Malakor," Kai yelled, "and I'm the virus you can't delete." The secondary characters, the technicians, the low-ranking ensigns, even the bruised guards who had been tossed around the docking bay earlier, began to look at one another. They had been told their entire lives that order was supreme, that the Queen was a symbol, and that Malakor was the only path to stability. But they were looking at a pilot who shouldn't be alive, and a Queen who was actually leading. The theme of their own repressed humanity began to spark. Ratchet, back on Ethelgard, had said the galaxy was boring. But as the transmission of this moment reached the lower decks of every ship in the fleet, thousands of ghost hands and shiners alike realized that the galaxy wasn't boring. It was just waiting for someone to be brave enough to be messy. Malakor lunged for Lyraean, his hand glowing with that sickly crimson light, but she was faster. She didn't use her power to kill him. She used it to strip him. With a sharp, outward motion of her arms, she shattered the ceremonial armor he wore, the plates of obsidian falling to the deck with a hollow clatter. She stripped the command codes from his wrist link and the authority from his voice. "You are no longer the regent," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a thunderclap. You are just a man who forgot that stars only shine because they are burning. Malachor fell to his knees, not because of a blow, but because the illusion of his absolute control had vanished. Without the fear he projected, he was just a hollow shell in expensive robes. Kai walked toward the elevator. Every step was a battle against gravity and exhaustion, but he didn't stumble. He reached the lift and hit the button for the command deck. As the doors closed, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the polished metal. He was a disaster. He was covered in oil, his hair was singed, and he looked like he'd been dragged through a black hole. And for the first time in 32 years, Kai Voss thought he looked exactly right. The starstruck junkie was beyond repair. It sat in the center of the hangar like a monument to a beautiful, violent rebellion. But as the sun of Valonus Prime began to rise over the horizon of the nebula, casting long golden shadows across the dreadnought's deck, the ship didn't look like trash. It looked like a chrysalis. 3 days had passed since the crash. The Eldritch Dominion was in a state of chaotic, wonderful flux. The marriage had been annulled by a queen who didn't ask for permission. Malachor was awaiting trial in a cell that was remarkably similar to the one he had planned for Kai. And the fleet was waiting. Kai stood on the observation deck of the Sovereign's Breath. He was wearing a new flight suit, black and simple with no insignia. His arm was in a high-tech sling, and his face was a map of healing bruises. He was watching a dozen shuttlecraft weave through the crystalline dust of the nebula, carrying diplomats and refugees alike. The engineers say they might be able to salvage the flight recorder, a voice said behind him. Kai turned. Lyran was standing there, framed by the immense glass of the observation window. She wasn't wearing the silver gown or the royal jewelry. She was wearing a simple tunic, her long ears relaxed and twitching slightly in the ambient hum of the ship. "Let them keep it," Kai said, leaning against the railing with his good arm. "I don't need a black box to tell me how I crashed. I remember every second of it. It was the best flying I've ever done." "It was," she agreed, stepping beside him. "The Council is terrified of you, you know. They don't know how to categorize a human who uses a queen's dress as a structural support for a kinetic engine. Tell them I'm a specialized consultant in the field of doing things the wrong way." Kai grinned. "I charge 50,000 credits an hour, plus snacks." Lyran laughed, and this time the sound didn't just fill the room. It seemed to resonate with the stars outside. She looked at him, her indigo eyes soft. "What will you do now, Kai? You have no ship, you have no cargo, and you are technically the most famous terrorist in 3 sectors." Kai looked out at the nebula. He thought about the starstruck junkie. He thought about the girl who hated jazz and the pilot who couldn't dance. "I think," Kai said slowly, "that I'm going to build something new. Not something perfect, something that's meant to break a little, so I have a reason to keep fixing it. And I heard there's a small moon near the rim that has the best biopairs in the galaxy. I've got a delivery to finish." "You would go back to hauling fruit?" "I'd go back to being me," Kai corrected. "But this time I'm bringing a better co-pilot." He reached out his hand, his scarred, grease-stained hand, and she took it without a second's hesitation. They stood there for a long time, 2 glitches in a system that was finally learning to breathe. "I spent 32 years looking at the world through the lens of my own failures. Every time a circuit blew or a docking hatch jammed, I didn't see a mechanical problem. I saw a reflection of myself. I thought that being broken meant I didn't have a seat at the table, that I was just a ghost in the machinery of people who actually knew what they were doing. I lived in the shadow of my own could-haves and should-be-betters. But standing in the wreckage of that hangar, I finally understood the truth. Perfection is just a fancy word for a dead end. If you're perfect, you're finished. There's no room for growth, no room for the beautiful, desperate improvisation that actually keeps the universe spinning. My flaws didn't stop me from saving Lyran. They were the only tools I had that were sharp enough to cut through Malachor's lies. I'm still a guy who dances like an injured shuttle. I'm still a guy who speaks before he thinks and gets grease on the upholstery. But I'm also the guy who punched a hole through a dreadnought with a dress and a dream. I used to hate the glitches in my life, but now I see them for what they are, the only parts of me that are truly real. We aren't defined by the parts of us that work according to the manual. We're defined by the parts that don't and what we choose to do with the pieces left over. I look at the stars now and I don't see an endless void I have to survive. I see a trillion different ways to be beautifully, spectacularly wrong. I spent so much time trying to fix myself that I almost forgot to live. I wonder, have you been carrying around a version of yourself that you think is broken? What would happen if, just for a moment, you stopped trying to fix the glitch and started wondering what it was trying to teach you? Kai squeezed Laren's hand, his fingers tracing the faint, honest scars on his own palm. He didn't look back at the wreck in the hangar. He simply turned toward the door, walking with a slight limp but a perfectly steady heart.